Lola Mae Pruitt had worked the same strip of garden ground along the east fence of her property for 41 years, and she had developed in that time the kind of patience that allows a person to notice things without immediately needing to understand them. She noticed, in the spring of 2018, that her neighbor Earl Hatch was spending an unusual amount of time at his farm pond. The pond sat in the southeast corner of the Hatch place, a quarter-acre of water that Earl's father, Henry Hatch, had put in sometime in 1972 using a borrowed bulldozer and 2 weeks of Saturdays. Henry had stocked it with largemouth bass and bluegill, and had spent Sunday afternoons there until he could not any longer. Earl had inherited the place in 2003 when Henry died, and had maintained the pond out of something that was not quite habit and not quite sentiment. He cleaned the bank each spring. He checked the overflow pipe after heavy rain. He did not fish it much. But in the spring of 2018, he was doing something different at the water's edge. Lola Mae could see a white cooler in the truck bed. She could see him at the bank with a dip net, the wrong tool for pulling fish out and the right one for putting them in. She watched for a while from her bean rows. Then she went back to her work. Earl Hatch is 55 years old now. He farms 80 acres in Limestone County, Alabama, and the pond his father built is the most written about quarter-acre of water in the county extension system. But in the spring of 2018, standing at the bank with a cooler full of tilapia fingerlings and no one paying attention, he was just a farmer doing something that everyone who noticed thought was peculiar, and nobody thought was important. Including, for a while, Lola Mae. There is something about a person who doesn't need to prove anything to do what they believe is right. If you know what I mean, you know why this story is worth your time. Subscribe before we go further. It matters where it's going. Limestone County sits in the Tennessee Valley region of northern Alabama, where the land flattens along the river plain and the soil runs from sandy loam on the uplands to the darker, heavier clay of the lower ground. The county seat is Athens, mostly row crops, corn, soybeans, some cotton on the sandier ground, with cattle operations on the pasture ground and poultry on the contract farms. The kind of county where a man can farm the same ground his grandfather farmed if he's careful, and where a bad year still means what it always meant. It is not a county that struggles for water in most years. The Tennessee River is close, the groundwater table is reasonably reliable, and most growing seasons bring enough rain to move fertilizer into the root zone and keep the crops going. But 2019 was not most years. The drought settled onto Limestone County gradually that summer, and then with a finality that forecasters did not predict until it was already underway. June went dry. The rain forecast for the second week did not come, and the revised forecast for the third week was 0 probability of meaningful precipitation. The USDA Drought Monitor placed most of northern Alabama in D2, severe drought, conditions by the third week of June, and D3, extreme drought, by the middle of July. Soil moisture was depleted through the upper profile. Corn across the county was showing the early signs of stress by the first week of July, leaf curl in the afternoon heat, the stalks drawing moisture from their own lower leaves to protect the developing ears. The County Farm Bureau's post-season summary recorded the average corn yield at 53% of the 5-year county average. Some growers with deep wells and full irrigation pulled better. Growers without those resources pulled worse. Earl Hatch pulled 94% of his 5-year average. His fields did not curl in July. They stayed dark green through the weeks when his neighbors' fields were showing the pale rolled leaves that a corn plant makes when it is managing a crisis. The difference between Earl's ground and the ground on either side of it was visible from the road. The difference was the pond. Earl had farmed the Hatch place since 2003. Before that, he had worked off-farm for 12 years, construction work mostly, some driving, while his father managed the ground. When Henry died, Earl came back to what was there: 80 acres, a set of worn but debt-free equipment, including a John Deere 4640 with over 10,000 hours on it, a small beef cow operation on the back pasture, and the pond in the southeast corner. He was not a man who drew attention. He went to the county extension meetings when the topic was relevant, and left when they were done. He bought his inputs from the Agri-South dealer in Athens, a man named Dale Shepard, who had covered the county for 17 years, and who had good information on fertility programs and pest management, and who Earl trusted on most things. In the spring of 2018, Earl told Dale he was reducing his nitrogen application on the fields nearest the pond by 40 pounds per acre because he planned to supplement with pond water from a tilapia system he was building. Dale was quiet for a moment. He said he was not sure that was an agronomically sound approach. He said dissolved nitrogen in farm pond water was not generally high enough to substitute meaningfully for a commercial fertility program. He said he would be glad to run a water test on Earl's pond if Earl brought him a sample, which he thought would illustrate the point. Earl said he'd bring a sample. He did not change his plan. Word moved through the county the way it does in small places, which is without effort and without any particular malice. A neighboring farmer named Greg Inzer heard about the tilapia at the co-op and mentioned it to a few people. Owen Barker, who ran 400 acres of cotton on the north end of the county and whose family had been neighbors with Henry Hatch's family before Earl was born, said he had heard about the pond plan and that it reminded him of something his own father had tried with catfish in the 60s, though he could not remember how it had come out. Nobody could tell him. The conversation moved on. The general interpretation that Earl was cutting input costs in a way that would hurt his yields was reasonable on its face. Several people held it, not unkind about it, not dismissive, just working with the most reasonable conclusion available. None of them were wrong to think that. They were just wrong. The pond that Henry Hatch had built in 1972 was, by 2018, a functional piece of water with no particular distinction. Largemouth bass and bluegill had been reproducing in it without assistance for decades. The bank was clear. The overflow pipe, poured concrete, original, was sound. The pond ran roughly 8 feet deep at center and 4 feet at the margins, and it held full in wet years and dropped a foot or so in dry ones and recovered each fall. It was not a commercial asset, not a managed aquaculture system, not anything a farm appraisal would have valued beyond its utility as an irrigation source. The irrigation setup Earl had used for years was simple: a 2-inch Flotex submersible pump on a 30-foot cord, a buried line to the field, overhead sprinklers for the sweet corn. In a typical year, he ran it 6 to 8 times through the growing season. In a dry year, more. In March of 2018, he stocked the pond with 400 Nile tilapia fingerlings, Oreochromis niloticus, the fast-growing standard commercial variety from a supplier in Georgia. The fingerlings cost $186 shipped. He added a small aeration unit to maintain dissolved oxygen levels, which cost $44 secondhand from a classified listing in the Farm Bureau newsletter. $230. That was the whole of the investment. Dale Shepard ran the water sample Earl brought him in May, about 6 weeks after the tilapia went in. The results showed dissolved nitrogen at 3.8 parts per million, comparable to any farm pond in the county, not substantially different from Earl's well water. Dale shared the results with Earl and said the data did not yet show a meaningful fertility advantage to the pond water. Earl thanked him for running the test. He asked Dale to keep the results on file. He said he would be back with another sample in August. Then, he went back to the pond. What Earl was doing at the pond through that spring and summer was not simply stocking fish and waiting. He had read. He had read more carefully than most people who knew him would have predicted, because Earl was not someone who announced what he was thinking about. Through the county library's database access to agricultural journals, he had found 3 papers on integrated fish culture systems, 2 on the Vietnamese VAC model, Vuong Ao Truong, meaning garden, pond, and livestock combined in a closed loop, and 1 older study from USTA-funded research in the 1980s on aquaponics as a food production system in limited resource settings. He had also found a 1974 Alabama Cooperative Extension Bulletin on farm pond management. He had found it in a box of his father's papers, still filed by year. His father had underlined a paragraph in it, a single paragraph in pencil, that described how older farmers in the county had used water from well-stocked fish ponds to irrigate kitchen gardens, with results that were, the bulletin noted, difficult to explain given the generally low nutrient load of pond water. Henry Hatch had underlined that paragraph sometime before 1974. He had filed the bulletin, and as far as Earl could tell, had done nothing with it. The farm continued. The pond sat in the corner. The bass and bluegill reproduced without help. Whatever Henry had been thinking when he drew that line in pencil, it had not gone further than the line. Earl sat with that paragraph in the kitchen in February of 2018 for a long time. He did not know what his father had made of it. He did not know why Henry had marked it and not acted on it. Probably the reason anyone marks something and moves on, which is that the moment passes and the work is always there, and a theory about pond water doesn't feed anything. But the line was there, in his father's handwriting, in a box that had sat in the equipment shed for 44 years. He went to the extension database the next morning and started reading. He did not tell anyone he was doing this. Not his wife. Not Dale. He wasn't sure yet what he was looking for. 6 weeks of reading. 6 weeks of notes in the margins of printouts from the library computer. Then he felt sure enough to order the fingerlings. Lola May, watching through the spring and into summer of 2018, noticed Earl at the pond more consistently than maintenance required. She noticed him walking the field edges on mornings after he ran the pump. She noticed, by late June, that the corn rows nearest the pump outlet were running a shade darker green than the rows toward the center of the field. She mentioned it over the fence one afternoon. She said his corn looked different near the pond end. Earl said he thought so too. He did not say more than that. What happens in a pond stocked with fish at sufficient density is this. Fish excrete ammonia continuously through their gills, not in solid waste alone, but dissolved into the water around them as a constant byproduct of metabolism. In a warm pond through a southern summer, that ammonia feeds a population of naturally occurring bacteria, Nitrosomonas and Nitrospira, present in any healthy body of water, that convert it first to nitrite and then to nitrate. Nitrate is the form of nitrogen that plant roots absorb. It is what commercial nitrogen fertilizer becomes after it is applied to soil and worked by the same bacterial process. The pond was running the same conversion in the water column, without cost, without application, without loss to the air. By August of 2018, Earl had brought Dale Shepard the second sample as promised. The dissolved nitrogen in the pond had risen to 17 parts per million, from 3. 8 parts per million in May. Earl's well water tested at 1. 4 parts per million. There is also phosphorus. Fish waste carries it. Tilapia in particular are bottom feeders. They stir the pond floor, releasing phosphorus bound to the silt into the water column. And tilapia graze on algae and aquatic weeds, which keeps the water cleaner and the dissolved oxygen higher than an unstocked pond of comparable size. When Earl ran the pump during the dry stretches of June and July, he was not moving plain water onto his corn. He was moving water carrying 17 parts per million of dissolved nitrogen and measurable dissolved phosphorus directly to the root zone. Delivered in solution, no volatilization possible, as consistent as any drip system, and drawn from 30 feet away. In a drought year, when rain cannot push surface-applied nitrogen into the root zone and volatilization losses climb with soil temperature, that delivery method matters in ways a normal year never reveals. The drought of 2019 settled onto the county and stayed. By the third week of July, Earl's neighbors were running irrigation on whatever schedules their wells and systems would allow. One neighbor's shallow well dropped far enough that the pump was pulling air on the evening run. The fields along County Road 36 were showing the rolled, pale leaves of drought-stressed corn, the stalks doing what corn does when it cannot get enough water, which is sacrifice the leaves to save the year. Earl had the pond. A quarter acre, 8 feet deep at center, held enough water to run the pump 14 times through July and August, once every 4 to 5 days on the near ground, weekly on the far end of the field. The water he was moving was not well water. It was pond water, fish run all summer, carrying dissolved nitrogen at 17 parts per million to a root zone that needed it. Greg Inzer drove by on the third week of July and slowed down. Earl's corn was standing flat and dark. Across the road, Greg's field was curled. He stopped. He sat in the truck for a moment. Then he got out and stood at the fence. Earl came out to meet him. They stood at the fence together, looking at both fields without saying much. Then Greg asked if he could walk Earl's ground. They walked it that afternoon, Earl saying less than he might have, letting the corn say what it was. He pointed out the rows nearest the pump outlet. The darkest green, the heaviest ear. He pointed out the far rows, still good, better than anything across the road, but lighter than the near ground. Greg walked back to the fence line. He looked at his own field across the road for a while. "The pond water," he said. "The pond water," Earl said. Greg went home and called the county extension office. Roy Busby had been the Limestone County Extension agent for 9 years. He drove out the following week. He walked the fields with Earl. He took photographs of the corn alongside the neighboring fields. He took a water sample from the pond. He asked Earl to walk him through the system, the stocking rate, the aeration, the pump schedule, how many applications per week, the line layout. Earl walked him through it. He showed him the stocking calendar. He showed him the pump schedule, written in the ledger by date. Then he went to the equipment shed and came back with a box of his father's papers and took out the 1974 bulletin. He opened it to the underlined paragraph. Roy read it. He looked up at Earl. He looked at the bulletin again. He said he would like to feature the Hatch Farm in the August County Farm Bureau newsletter. He said he thought the other producers in the county needed to see what they were looking at before they needed it. Earl said that was fine with him. The August newsletter ran a photograph of Earl at the pond bank with the corn visible in the background, green, standing, in the third week of a D3 drought year. The headline was plain: Limestone County Farm uses fish pond water to maintain yields in drought. The article ran the water test numbers. It ran the yield projection. It ran the year and the condition of the original pond and what Earl's father had underlined in a bulletin 45 years before. Dale Shepard called Earl the following Monday. He said he owed him an apology for the note of skepticism in 2018. He said the August water test numbers, 17 parts per million of dissolved nitrogen, had not been what he expected when Earl first brought the concept to him. He said he was going to reach out to the state extension specialist and ask whether there was literature he had missed. Earl said he appreciated the call. He said the 1974 Alabama Cooperative Extension Bulletin on Farm Pond Management was a reasonable starting point, and that a good copy was available in Box 3 of Henry Hatch's equipment shed papers if Dale ever wanted to read the whole thing. The Limestone County Farm Bureau's post-season report placed the county corn average at 53% of the 5-year average. Some operations with deep wells and full irrigation came in better. Operations without irrigation, worse. The Hatch farm averaged 172 bushels per acre across 80 acres. Earl's 5-year average had been 183 bushels per acre. That made 2019 a 94% year in a 53% county. He did not make a speech about this. He wrote the numbers in a ledger he kept on the kitchen shelf, the same shelf where the 1974 bulletin sat now, and went to fall maintenance. The call started in October. 3 neighboring farmers that month alone asking about the pond system, the stocking rate, the aeration requirements, the pump layout, how long before the water chemistry changed enough to matter. Earl answered each call the same way. He invited the farmer out to the farm and walked him through it in person, which took longer, but was more complete. By 2021, 4 farms in Limestone County were running modified versions of the system. 2 were using the same Georgia fingerling supplier. A 5th farm, to the north, was running tilapia in a repurposed 300-gallon Rubbermaid stock tank rather than a natural pond, which produced more concentrated water per gallon, and which Earl thought was worth studying further. Lola Mae Pruitt's garden has been irrigated from a line Earl ran to her fence in 2020, a neighborly gesture that cost him $80 in parts. And an afternoon, she grew tomatoes that summer that a woman at the Athens farmers market said were the finest she had purchased in years. Lola Mae thanked her and said she believed it was the water. She was not wrong. Earl still farms 80 acres. The tilapia go in each April and come out each October when the water drops below the temperature they can survive. He fills mason jars with water samples at the start and end of each season and keeps them labeled on the shelf. He harvests the fish in the fall, more than his household can eat in any year, and distributes them to neighbors at no cost, because the fish are a byproduct of the system and not the point, and because Earl Hatch is that kind of man. The pond is 53 years old. The overflow pipe is the original concrete. The bank is clear. The bass and the bluegill still reproduce on their own, alongside the tilapia, in the water Henry Hatch moved with a borrowed bulldozer over 2 weeks of Saturdays in 1972. Lola Mae is 71 years old now. She still gardens the east fence strip. She said once, to someone at the Methodist Church in Athens, that she had watched Earl Hatch stand at the edge of that pond for 3 years before she understood what she had been watching. She said she had thought he was tending his father's memory. She said it turned out he had been tending his father's question, which was a different kind of thing, though it looked the same from the outside. Henry Hatch underlined a paragraph in a bulletin in 1974 and put it in a box. He did not live long enough to find out what the paragraph meant. It is the ordinary fate of a careful attention to mark something and move on and hope the mark survives you. It had survived him. By 45 years and a drought and a son who learned to sit still with the same questions. There are things a piece of ground teaches you right away, and things it holds back until you are ready. The pond had been ready for a long time. Earl got there eventually.